The thing about Kepler Station's sub-level entertainment district was that it attracted exactly the kind of clientele who thought watching sentient beings pummel each other into paste constituted an evening well spent. Which, to be fair, it absolutely did. Assuming you weren't the one getting pummeled. Deep in the station's bowels, where the air recyclers wheezed and the artificial gravity fluctuated just enough to make your inner ear question reality, the Crimson Pit operated with the kind of brazen illegality that only thrived when nobody particularly cared to stop it. The management had wisely positioned their establishment in that sweet spot of galactic jurisdiction, where 3 different legal systems overlapped and promptly canceled each other out into blissful regulatory chaos. Tonight's crowd was particularly diverse, which was diplomatic speak for volatile. Veltari merchants nursed synthetic alcohol through their breathing apparatus, while calculating odds on organic tablets that probably violated 14 different copyright laws. A cluster of Zephyrian diplomats had claimed the premium viewing booth, their crystalline forms refracting the arena's harsh lighting into rainbow patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the cheaper seats, Krex laborers placed bets with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious conversion or imminent death. "Gentle beings, the main event," the announcer's voice crackled through translation circuits that had seen better decades. In the red corner, weighing in at 437 standard kilograms, wearing full ceremonial battle armor blessed by the war priests of Thek Prime, Champion Vorthak the Unbreakable. The crowd's response was appropriately thunderous. Vorthak stepped into the arena like a walking monument to the concept of overkill. His armor was a masterwork of Thekvar military engineering, ablative plating over kinetic dampeners, over energy shields, over what was probably another layer of ablative plating, because Thekvar philosophy had never met redundancy. It didn't immediately want to marry and have children with. And in the blue corner, the announcer continued, with the sort of pause that suggested either dramatic effect or a malfunctioning vocal synthesizer. Over 97% of viewers here are watching without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the journey. Every click helps us grow stronger, and you'll never miss the next epic story. Weighing in at significantly less, representing the Terran Collective, the Peacekeeper. The human who entered the arena looked like someone had ordered a warrior from a discount catalog and received a middle management consultant instead. Average height, average build, wearing what appeared to be standard-issue gray clothing that wouldn't look out of place in a bureaucratic office. No armor, no visible weapons, no ceremonial anything. The betting boards went absolutely berserk. 10,000 against survival past the first minute, shouted a Veltari trader, his breathing apparatus fluttering with excitement. 20,000 she doesn't land a single hit, countered a Zephyrian, their crystalline, body chiming with what passed for laughter in their species. "I'll take those odds," said a voice from the VIP section. Conversation stopped. Not the polite, gradual cessation of chatter you might expect in civilized society, but the abrupt, universe has just shifted on its axis kind of silence that made everyone suddenly very interested in their drinks. The voice belonged to Ket Mori, unofficial king of Kepler Station's unofficial economy. The Hyven crime lord rarely spoke during matches, preferring to let his subordinates handle the crude business of actually interacting with customers. When he did speak, it usually meant someone was about to have a very educational experience about the fragility of their continued existence. "You'll take the odds?" asked the Veltari trader, his breathing apparatus now producing sounds suggestive of mild cardiac distress. "All of them," Ket Mori said pleasantly. "Every bet against the human. I'll cover them personally." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the arena, Vorthak was performing what could generously be called a pre-battle ritual and less generously be called interpretive dance with weapons. The human, the peacekeeper, stood perfectly still, watching. The Zephyrian diplomat began calculating. That's approximately 47 million credits. 47,300,000 and change, Ketmori corrected. I checked. A Krex laborer in the back raised a tentative appendage. Boss, you sure about this? She don't look like much. Ketmori's 6 eyes focused on the worker with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly interesting microscopic specimens. Tell me, Grixtal, what do you know about human military history? They fight good? They fight stupid, interjected the Veltari trader. Everyone knows this. Humans refuse to use proper equipment. They have this bizarre fixation on fair fights and honorable combat. Their own military advisors have classified human tactical doctrine as aggressively counterproductive. Exactly, Ketmori smiled, which was disturbing because Hyven facial expressions translated poorly across species lines. They fight stupid. Question is, stupid like a fox or stupid like dinner? Down in the arena, the peacekeeper had begun her own pre-fight routine. Unlike Vorthak's elaborate weapon ceremonies, hers consisted of removing her shoes, rolling up her sleeves, and stretching her neck with the sort of casual indifference usually associated with waiting for public transportation. Fighters, assume positions, called the referee, a heavily augmented Krex, whose job primarily involved staying far enough away from the combatants to avoid becoming collateral damage. Vorthak raised his ceremonial war club, a weapon that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets, and bellowed something in Thekvar that the translation circuits diplomatically rendered as aggressive vocalization indicating battle readiness and possible digestive satisfaction. The peacekeeper looked up at the betting displays, where the odds against her survival had reached numbers that approached the theoretical rather than the practical. She smiled. Before we begin, she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the lack of vocal augmentation. I have a question for the champion. Vorthak's helmet turned toward her, optical sensors focusing. Speak, small human. Your words will be the last heard in this arena. Do you know why they call me the Peacekeeper? The champion's laugh rumbled through his armor's audio systems. Because humans name everything backwards. You bring war, so you call yourself peace. Human logic. Close, she said, beginning to walk in a slow circle around him. Vorthak turned to track her movement, his heavy armor servos whining with the effort, but not quite right. Enlighten me then, before I crush you. The peacekeeper stopped walking. For a moment she stood perfectly still in the arena's center, surrounded by 400 kilograms of military-grade death machine, wearing nothing but standard clothing and an expression of mild interest. They call me the Peacekeeper, she said, because after I'm done, everything gets very, very quiet. The betting boards flickered as last-minute wagers flooded in. Somewhere in the crowd, a Zephyrian muttered something about human psychological warfare being criminally primitive. A Veltari trader loudly proclaimed that intimidation tactics only worked if you actually had the firepower to back them up. In the VIP booth, Ketmori leaned forward slightly, his 6 eyes fixed on the human who stood like a small, impossibly calm island in the center of a very expensive storm. Begin, shouted the referee. And that's when things got interesting. In the elevated viewing gallery, reserved for what passed as intellectual discourse among criminals, 3 representatives of galactic civilization were having the sort of argument that academics usually settled with footnotes and tenure committees. Here, it might end in bloodshed, which was honestly more efficient. The fundamental flaw in human military doctrine, declared scholar Vexhani, adjusting the feeding tubes that connected to her Veltari breathing apparatus, is their persistent belief that warfare should be aesthetically pleasing. They've weaponized their own mortality into performance art. Her companion, Ambassador Thrillvex of the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps, chimed disagreement through the harmonic frequencies that served as their species' equivalent of derisive laughter. Performance art implies deliberate craft. What we observe in human combat behavior is pure evolutionary accident. They never developed proper survival instincts. With respect, interrupted Chief Engineer Bakthul, his Krex manipulator arms gesturing emphatically while his primary hands gripped what appeared to be fermented algae. You're both missing the point. Look, at the historical data. He activated a holographic display that flickered into existence above their table, showing tactical analyses that would have made military historians weep with either joy or despair. Battle formations from humanity's ancient past materialized in glowing detail. Phalanxes, shield walls, cavalry charges that had all the tactical sophistication of organized suicide. Thermopylae, Bakthul continued, highlighting a particularly absurd tactical scenario. 300 Spartans versus several 100,000 Persians. Any rational species would have surrendered, negotiated, or at minimum invested in better armor. Instead, they stripped down to bronze underwear and decided to make the invasion inconvenient. Precisely my point, Vexhani wheezed through her apparatus. Decorative warfare. They could have built walls, employed ranged weapons, used terrain advantages effectively. Instead, they chose to die prettily. But they won, Thrillvex observed, their crystalline form refracting the hologram into fractal patterns. Tactically, they lost. Strategically, they achieved their objectives. The Persian advance was delayed, Greek morale was bolstered, and their sacrifice became foundational mythology for their entire civilization. Down in the arena, Vorthak had begun his assault with the methodical precision of a mining operation. His war club swept through space the Peacekeeper had occupied approximately 1 second earlier, generating wind displacement that would have knocked over small furniture. She wasn't there to be knocked over, having developed the apparently revolutionary tactical concept of not being where deadly weapons were pointed. Watch the footwork, Bakthul said, zooming his display to track the human's movement patterns. She's not dodging randomly. There's a pattern here. The Peacekeeper moved like water around Vorthak's attacks, each near miss bringing her incrementally closer to her opponent. She wasn't retreating. She was spiraling inward, using his own momentum against him while staying just outside his weapon's effective range. Standard evasion protocols would dictate maintaining maximum distance, Vexhani noted. Create space, seek ranged weapons, establish defensive positions. She's doing the opposite. Because she's insane, Thrillvex stated flatly. Human combat doctrine is predicated on the assumption that dying gloriously is preferable to living pragmatically. It's a species-wide death wish expressed through ritualized violence. Is it, though? Bakthul pulled up another historical file. Consider the Battle of Rorke's Drift. 150 British soldiers against 4,000 Zulu warriors. Mathematically impossible odds. The humans built a defensive perimeter out of supply crates and held it for 12 hours. The hologram shifted to show the battle's progression. British positions slowly contracting as casualties mounted and ammunition dwindled. Any logical species would have attempted breakout, retreat, or negotiated surrender. The humans stayed put and shot everything that moved until they ran out of things to shoot. And they won, Vexhani admitted grudgingly. They won, Bakthul confirmed. Not through superior technology, not through tactical brilliance, but through sheer bloody-minded refusal to acknowledge mathematical reality. In the arena, Vorthak's attacks were becoming more aggressive and correspondingly less precise. His armor's servo systems were heating up from the constant movement, and thermal regulation was beginning to struggle with the energy output required to swing a weapon that weighed more than most personal vehicles. The Peacekeeper, meanwhile, appeared to be having a pleasant jog. She'd begun talking to her opponent, though the conversation was largely one-sided due to Vorthak's tendency to respond to communication attempts with murder. "You know what your problem is?" she called out, sliding under a particularly enthusiastic club swing that embedded the weapon 6 inches into the arena floor. "You're fighting the wrong war." Vorthak wrenched his weapon free, servos whining. "I fight the war before me, human." "No, you're fighting the war your species prepared you for. Formation combat, armor versus armor, strength against strength." She paused directly in front of him, well within his weapon's reach. "But I'm not your species." The champion's reply was an overhead strike that should have reduced her to component molecules. Instead, she stepped into the attack's path, moving faster than his armor's targeting systems could track, and placed one bare hand against his chest plate. "What are you?" Vorthak began. Then he discovered what humans had learned about leverage approximately 10,000 years before anyone else in the galaxy had figured out agriculture. The champion of Thek Prime, weighing 437 kilograms in full battle armor, went flying. Not far, the laws of physics still applied, but far enough to demonstrate that mass times acceleration remained a universal constant, regardless of who was doing the accelerating. "Impossible," breathed Thrillvex. "Biomechanically speaking, absolutely," Vexhani agreed. "She can't generate sufficient force to—" "She didn't," Bokthul interrupted, his engineering background finally catching up with what he'd witnessed. "Look at the replay." The hologram rewound, showing the moment of contact in slow motion. The Peacekeeper hadn't pushed Vorthak. She'd redirected his own momentum, using his forward motion and the weight of his armor to send him exactly where physics wanted him to go anyway. "Aikido," Bokthul whispered. "Ancient human martial art. The philosophy is using an opponent's strength against them." "But that's—" Thrillvex paused, their harmonic frequencies modulating as they processed the implications. "That's actually sensible. Strategic thinking. Why don't more species develop similar techniques? Because," Vexhani said slowly, "most species develop armor and weapons to avoid close combat entirely. Only humans are crazy enough to deliberately get closer to things trying to kill them." Down in the arena, Vorthak was struggling to his feet, his armor's gyroscopic systems recalibrating after the unexpected trajectory adjustment. The Peacekeeper stood exactly where she'd been, hands at her sides, looking like someone waiting for a delayed public transport connection. "Round 2?" she asked politely. In the viewing gallery, 3 of the galaxy's most educated minds stared at tactical analyses that were beginning to suggest they might have fundamentally misunderstood something important about human military philosophy. "Gentle beings," Bokthul said quietly, "I believe we may need to recalculate our assumptions." Vorthak's second assault came with considerably more caution and significantly less theatrical flourish. The Thekvar had apparently reached that uncomfortable moment in any warrior's career when they realized their opponent might not be operating from the same tactical manual. "You fight strangely, human," he growled, his armor's audio systems crackling with static that suggested either battle damage or mounting frustration. "I fight efficiently," the Peacekeeper corrected, circling him at a distance that was somehow simultaneously respectful and menacing. "Your people fight like they're trying to impress someone. Mine fight like they're trying to go home for dinner." This philosophical distinction became immediately relevant, as Vorthak discovered the difference between combat as ritual and combat as problem-solving exercise. His next attack sequence, a masterful display of traditional Thekvar weapon forms that had been perfected over 3 millennia, met empty air, as the human simply wasn't where doctrine suggested she should be. Instead, she was behind him. "The armor," she observed conversationally, "is beautiful." Really magnificent craftsmanship. Must have cost a fortune. Vorthak spun, his weapon tracking in a wide arc designed to clear his entire defensive perimeter. Standard anti-flanking maneuver, executed perfectly according to regulation. It also weighs more than I do, the Peacekeeper continued, now somehow beside him despite the fact that his sensors insisted she'd been behind him approximately 1 second earlier. Which makes you very strong, very well protected, and very predictable. She touched his elbow joint, barely a tap, as he completed his defensive sweep. The tiny contact redirected his momentum just enough to extend his turn into something approaching a pirouette, which would have been graceful in a ballet and was considerably less dignified in full battle armor. In the premium seating sections, betting odds began fluctuating with the kind of frantic energy usually associated with currency collapse or theological revolution. The smart money, what little of it remained, started quietly hedging positions. "This shouldn't be possible," muttered a Veltari bookmaker, watching his carefully calculated profit margins evaporate in real time. "She's not even armed." "She doesn't need weapons," observed a Zephyrian spectator, whose crystalline form was vibrating at frequencies that suggested either excitement or impending structural failure. "She's turned the entire arena into a weapon." This was not entirely metaphorical. The Peacekeeper had begun using every element of the fighting space to her advantage. The slight elevation changes in the floor, the ambient lighting that cast shadows, even the acoustic properties of the arena itself. When Vorthak charged, she used his own footsteps to mask her movement. When he paused to recalibrate, she exploited the momentary stillness to reposition. "Tell me, champion," she called out during one of these tactical pauses, "what's the longest you've ever fought without landing a single strike?" Vorthak's response was immediate and involved reducing a section of arena wall to decorative gravel. The Peacekeeper had vacated that particular spot approximately 30 milliseconds earlier, suggesting either remarkable reflexes or disturbing precognitive abilities. "You mock me, human." "Not at all. I'm genuinely curious about Thekvar endurance protocols. How long can that armor's power systems maintain full combat operations?" The question was more pointed than Vorthak initially realized. His armor was indeed a masterwork of military engineering, but masterworks tended to prioritize effectiveness over efficiency. The servo systems required to move 400 kilograms of protection and weaponry consumed energy at rates that would make power grid engineers weep. "Long enough," he snarled, though his internal diagnostics were painting a progressively less optimistic picture. "Approximately 17 more minutes at current consumption rates," the Peacekeeper said helpfully. "I've been counting." She had, in fact, been counting, among other things, the number of steps in his standard attack patterns, the cooling cycle intervals of his weapon systems, the precise thermal signature variations that indicated when his targeting computers were recalibrating, the subtle shifts in servo pitch that suggested maintenance schedules had been optimistically estimated. Humans, it turned out, were exceptionally good at pattern recognition when their continued existence depended on it. "You've been studying me," Vorthak accused. "I've been watching you broadcast every tactical decision through body language, equipment sounds, and combat doctrine that hasn't been updated since your species discovered metallurgy," she replied. "It's not studying. It's listening." The champion's next attack came with genuine fury behind it, which made it both more dangerous and considerably more predictable. Fury, while emotionally satisfying, was tactically limiting. It narrowed focus, reduced adaptability, and encouraged exactly the kind of straightforward assault that the Peacekeeper had been patiently waiting for. She met his charge head-on, which violated approximately 17 different principles of asymmetric warfare, and was therefore the last thing his combat systems expected. Instead of dodging, She stepped into the weapon's path, caught his wrist mid-swing, and demonstrated another ancient human discovery: the mechanical advantage of fulcrums and leverage points. Physics, being notably indifferent to species pride, proceeded to educate the champion about momentum conservation. The war club flew across the arena, embedding itself in the reinforced viewing barrier with enough force to make the VIP section suddenly very interested in their emergency exits. Vorthak stared at his empty hand, then at the human who had somehow disarmed 4 centuries of military tradition with what appeared to be basic geometry. "Impossible," he whispered. "Improbable," the peacekeeper corrected. "Impossible would be you winning this fight while I'm paying attention." The arena had gone absolutely silent. In the betting sections, odds displays flickered between calculations as automated systems tried to process probability matrices that had fundamentally shifted beyond their programming parameters. Several bookmakers were quietly updating their personal life insurance policies. Vorthak reached for his secondary weapon, a ceremonial blade that was considerably lighter than his primary armament and infinitely more deadly at close range. The motion was smooth, practiced, and entirely too slow. The peacekeeper was already moving before his hand reached the weapon. Not toward him, not away from him, but in a trajectory that placed her exactly where his defensive training insisted she couldn't be. Inside his guard, close enough to count his armor's rivet patterns, positioned where every weapon he carried became geometrically useless. "The thing about armor," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly despite their proximity, "is that it's designed to protect you from attacks coming from outside." Her hand found a pressure point behind his neck that Thekvar anatomy texts filed under theoretical vulnerabilities and engineering redundancy failures. Vorthak discovered that his species' renowned physical resilience had some interesting exceptions when the right neural clusters were addressed with sufficient precision. The champion of Thek Prime collapsed like a controlled demolition, his armor systems automatically engaging emergency medical protocols as consciousness gracefully departed. The peacekeeper stepped back, brushing dust from her sleeves with the casual indifference of someone who had just completed a moderately challenging crossword puzzle. In the sudden, crystalline silence that followed, she looked up at the stunned crowd. "Next?" Nobody volunteered. The silence stretched long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable, which was remarkable considering the audience typically found entertainment in watching people get violently rearranged. Medical drones descended to collect Vorthak's unconscious form, their sensors confirming what everyone had witnessed, but nobody particularly wanted to acknowledge. The champion was alive, uninjured, and merely experiencing an involuntary sabbatical from consciousness. "Well," announced the arena's automated systems with the sort of cheerful obliviousness that only artificial intelligence could muster, "that concludes tonight's scheduled entertainment. Please exit in an orderly fashion and remember to collect your winnings at the designated terminals." The crowd began its exodus with the kind of subdued murmuring usually reserved for funerals or tax audits. 47 million credits in bets had just shifted ownership in the span of approximately 8 minutes, which represented either the most profitable or most catastrophic evening in the Crimson Pit's operational history, depending on your perspective. The peacekeeper remained in the arena's center, apparently in no hurry to leave. She was looking up at the VIP section with an expression that suggested patience mixed with mild curiosity. "Fascinating display," came Ketmori's voice over the arena's communication system. "I don't suppose you'd care to join me for a conversation?" "Professional interest, you understand." "I thought you'd never ask," she replied. The VIP suite's luxury was the sort of aggressively tasteless opulence that announced its owner's wealth through sheer volume rather than aesthetic consideration. Ket Mori sat behind a desk that appeared to have been carved from a single crystal formation, probably liberated from some unfortunate mining operation. His 6 eyes tracked her movement as she entered, though he'd positioned himself to keep the conversation area well within reach of several concealed weapons systems. "Drink?" he offered, gesturing toward a cabinet stocked with exotic liquors from 17 different star systems. "Water, thanks." He poured himself something that glowed faintly purple and smelled like expensive mistakes. "You know, in 30 years of running entertainment operations, I've never seen anyone bet against themselves quite so effectively." The peacekeeper accepted her glass of water with the same casual composure she'd displayed while dismantling a trained killer. "You think I threw the fight?" "I think," Ket Mori said carefully, "that very few people would enter combat without armor, unless they were either supremely confident or completely insane." The preliminary betting suggested most observers favored the latter interpretation. "And now I'm wondering why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to manipulate gambling odds when there are considerably simpler ways to acquire 47 million credits." She smiled, and Ket Mori experienced the uncomfortable realization that he might not be the most dangerous individual in the room. "Because I wasn't after the money. No. The money was just proof of concept, demonstration that your establishment's security protocols have some interesting vulnerabilities." Ket Mori's primary arms moved subtly toward the concealed weapon controls built into his desk. The movement was smooth, practiced, and entirely pointless, as his visitor had somehow acquired knowledge of their exact location. "I wouldn't," she suggested pleasantly. "Those systems are designed to stop conventional threats. I'm not particularly conventional." "What do you want?" "Information. Specifically about shipments moving through your transportation networks. Cargo manifests, delivery schedules, security protocols. The kind of data that would help someone track very specific items moving through very unofficial channels." "And if I decline to provide this information?" The peacekeeper set down her water glass and stood, moving with the same unhurried confidence she'd displayed in the arena. "Then I'll have to acquire it through less cooperative methods, which would be inconvenient for both of us, but significantly more inconvenient for you." Ket Mori weighed his options, which was a brief process given that most of them involved varying degrees of personal dismemberment. "What kind of shipments?" "The kind that shouldn't exist. Weapons, technology, biological samples, things that civilized governments have agreed should remain theoretical rather than practical." "Black market arms dealing?" "Among other things. There's a network moving prohibited items between systems, using stations like this one as transfer points. Someone's been very clever about hiding the operation, but not clever enough to avoid creating patterns." Understanding dawned across Ket Mori's features, like a particularly unpleasant sunrise. "You're not a mercenary?" "No." "You're law enforcement?" "Also no." She moved toward the suite's viewing window, looking down at the arena where maintenance crews were still repairing Vorthak's structural modifications. "I'm something considerably less official and substantially more motivated." "Which is?" "Someone whose people were on the receiving end of weapons that shouldn't have existed, distributed through networks that shouldn't operate, by individuals who shouldn't be breathing." Her reflection in the transparent steel window showed an expression that was perfectly calm and absolutely terrifying. "I'm here to correct these administrative oversights." Ket Mori's business model had always relied on maintaining careful neutrality in galactic conflicts. He provided services, collected fees, and avoided taking sides in disputes that didn't directly affect his profit margins. The individual standing in his office represented the sort of personal problem that couldn't be solved through traditional criminal enterprise solutions. "The data you want will be provided voluntarily, or I'll acquire it through renovation of your information systems." Your choice. And in exchange? Your continued ability to operate these charming establishments without experiencing structural modifications. She turned from the window, and Ketmori found himself looking into eyes that held the sort of patient certainty usually associated with geological processes. Also, I'll ensure the 47 million credits find their way to several humanitarian organizations that specialize in rebuilding things that illegal weapons tend to destroy. You're giving away the money? I told you, I wasn't after the credits. I was after a conversation with someone who has access to the information I need. The betting manipulation was just efficient multitasking. Ketmori stared at her for several long moments, processing implications that were steadily becoming more uncomfortable. You orchestrated this entire evening. The fight, the betting, the odds manipulation, all of it was designed to get you into this room. The fight was also personally satisfying, she admitted. But yes, essentially correct. And if I'd refused to cover the bets? Then I would have found another way. This method simply had the advantage of funding refugee relief efforts while demonstrating exactly why cooperation would be in your best interests. The crime lord reached for his drink with hands that weren't entirely steady. What kind of monster are you? The peacekeeper smiled with genuine warmth. The kind that fights without armor because the real protection comes from knowing exactly what you're fighting for. She moved toward the suite's exit, pausing at the threshold. The data files will be ready when… Tomorrow, Ketmori said quietly. Excellent. Oh, and one more thing. You might want to update your arena's promotional materials. They said she couldn't win without armor. Makes a better tagline than witness certain death for entertainment value. The door closed behind her, with the soft finality of a well-oiled mechanism. Ketmori sat alone in his expensive suite, surrounded by the trappings of criminal success, and contemplated the uncomfortable realization that he'd just been comprehensively outmaneuvered by someone who'd walked into his establishment wearing office clothes and armed with nothing but physics. Somewhere in the station's depths, 47 million credits were being quietly redistributed to accounts that would fund medical supplies, reconstruction materials, and educational programs across 3-star systems. And in the arena below, maintenance crews finished cleaning up the debris from an evening that had started as entertainment and concluded as education about the fundamental unpredictability of a species that refused to fight sensibly. The betting boards flickered once more, displaying final odds that would be remembered as either the greatest upset or the most expensive lesson in galactic gaming history. Either way, it had been very educational indeed.